This is Closereads,
a philosophy podcast with Mark and Wes.
I'm Wes Alwan.
And I'm Mark Linsenmeyer. It's a new reading. We have been reading Christine Korsgaard on the Partially Examined Life, and she referred several times to this article by Harold Arthur Prichard, H.A. Prichard, from 1912, called Does Moral Philosophy Rest on a Mistake? It's apparently in the ethical intuitionism camp. Something, I think Korsgaard says, we don't, according to Prichard, we don't need to question how morality is obligatory, something like that. It is one of those things that says a lot of philosophy is not actually necessary, which seems in time with the time period, with logical positivism and things. I'm not sure exactly how, more is connected to Wittgenstein, who's connected to logical positivism, but logical positivism is the stupid version of that. So I don't know if this is, but I think I read this at some point in undergrad and found this at least clever, that it made me question what moral philosophy is supposed to be doing here. Did you know anything about this or this period, or?
No, I really don't.
Yeah, so he's an Oxford guy, looking at the wiki page. Yeah, moral intuitionism. Further, while he believes that moral obligations are justified by reasons, he does not believe that the reasons are external to the obligation itself. For instance, if a person is asked why he ought not to torture chipmunks, the only satisfying answer that could be given is that he ought not to torture chipmunks.
Yeah, lovely.
It's all just obvious.
Sure, this is going to be fun.
Well, let's see. She refers to it a lot. She thinks it's mistaken, but more than G.E. Moore, for instance, I think, in that book. Take it away.
Probably to most students of moral philosophy, there comes a time when they feel a vague sense of dissatisfaction with the whole subject. And if you didn't, you're going to feel it after reading this paper. And the sense of dissatisfaction tends to grow rather than to diminish. It is not so much that the positions and still more the arguments of particular thinkers seem unconvincing, though this is true. It is rather that the aim of the subject becomes increasingly obscure. What, it is asked, are we really going to learn by moral philosophy? What are books on moral philosophy really trying to show? And when their aim is clear, why are they so unconvincing and artificial? And again, why is it so difficult to substitute anything better? Personally, I have been led by growing dissatisfaction of this kind to wonder whether the reason may not be that the subject, at any rate as usually understood, consists in the attempt to answer an improper question. And in this article, I shall venture to contend that the existence of the whole subject, as usually understood, rests on a mistake, and on a mistake parallel to that on which rests, as I think, the subject usually called the theory of knowledge. It's actually usually called epistemology, but whatever.
Yeah, this is surprising.
So grandiose in its ambitions,
Well, yeah. I'm trying to think of the beginning of Hume's book, where he talks about, and actually I'm not remembering which inquiry this is, but he talks about there's sort of popular philosophy and there's this obscure stuff, and I'm trying to do this foundational obscure stuff. And so popular ethics, nobody doubts that is something that is useful, right? What should I actually do? And we can talk about mores, we can talk about difficult ethical quandaries, a Dear Abby sort of thing. But that's not what philosophy is supposed to be doing. It's supposed to be doing something a priori. It's supposed to be doing a psychological investigation, according to Hume, for instance. So why might one be led to think that kind of inquiry is useless, is spins out, is just like metaphysics that, oh, people just speculate on things and nobody agrees, and it all just like, no, it seems like moral philosophy makes significant progress, and clarifying what the questions are and what the facts of moral psychology are. I don't know that I share this frustration.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of what we do personally when it comes to ethical questions involves figuring out what we want to do with our lives. So we have competing values and there are trade-offs. And there's a lot of means and reasoning involved, as Hume. I'm just repeating a point made by Hume here, actually. Um, we have to figure out what the best means to the ends are. We have to figure out how different subordinate ends are related to larger ends. And if we have conflicting ends, then we have to sort out what's most important to us. And the same thing at a political level. Um, so if the environment is important on the one hand and the economy is important on the other, then policy solutions involve figuring out the relative balance there. Um, uh, so and then figuring out means to ends. So what are the best policies for the environment that aren't, catastrophic for the economy? Things like that. So what is philosophy? What can philosophy do for us in those situations?
Yeah, those what you described seems to presuppose a moral theory. If you already think
Yeah.
utilitarianism is correct, then yeah, let's just compute the benefits. But it's the can we come up with a theory that in all cases captures what we find valuable, what we don't find valuable, and will help us hopefully in those tricky cases, so we could more clearly, if it was Bentham's utilitarianism, an actual calculus that would able to add things, or Kant that says, well, it might seem like the little white lie is not going to produce more harm than telling the truth here. Well, it doesn't matter. According to his
Yeah.
theory, the lie, the prohibition against lying wins.
I mean, usually I think it is just a mishmash of approaches when we're at a practical level working on policy or our personal lives. We'll
Mm-hmm.
approach, right? People are interested in rights a lot and freedoms, and those are supposed to be hard stops to any sort of utility monster, right?
Yep.
Utilitarianism can't be used to justify infringement on rights, but then also people will tend to think largely in a utilitarian way as well. And then I think, even we could, at least for personal decisions, we could work out ways in which a virtue ethics sort of approach as the norm. So I think people switch between those approaches and balance them intuitively. And they're not going to, I don't think philosophy is going to lead us to make some kind of hard and fast, um, you know, uh, to give up one of those avenues. I think we just tend to use all of them. But yeah. So what is actual like hardcore moral philosophy have to offer us? I'm not so sure. I mean, you just have to be interested in the underlying question, which is like, what is the, as Korsgaard puts it, what is the source of normativity? Does it even make sense? Should we really just admit that there is no such thing as morality? That's a figment of our imagination. Um, that's kind of the question I think that really nags people who are interested in the subject enough to get into the deep theorizing, right? The meta ethical question.
Sure. I mean, there's also can I come up with a single theory that will explain all of our moral intuitions that will underlie? Is it utility? Do they reduce? And I tend to agree that that's probably not possible, that there are lots of reasons, and they might have different sources in different evolutionary things, that we have a cooperation thing, but then we also have a caring for our children thing. We have a recognizing people that have, or, creatures that have similar abilities to us. Uh, so it very well may be possible that on something like abortion, like, well, our care for the young, care for anything that's little and cute. Uh, Instinct says protect all little unborn things, but then the more Kantian member of the moral community treat anything that talks back to you as if it has moral rights. Well, then no, that's not going to count. And so it just might not. It's just something that we as a society figure out as we go, based on just the sentiment of the times. I think there is no, but I don't think that's what he's talking about here. I don't think he's saying that moral theorizing is trying to reify something that does not exist, right? That's what I'm saying is coming from the point of view of there is no objective normativity. There are just various impulses that we have, various mores that we as a culture have developed, and we just want to make those all consistent with each other to figure out what we want to do. But none of that answers what Korsgaard puts as the normativity question, that just because we have these standards, whatever their source, how do you deal with somebody who is a skeptic about those? Do they have moral force that, actually commands in some strong way? Does that notion even make sense? And I think you're right. That's what he's going to, why Korsgaard is writing about this paper. That's going to be his line, is to question that question.
Yeah, I think the way Korsgaard describes it is she's going to say that Prichard wants to reduce normativity to the question of whether moral concepts are being used accurately, which just sidesteps the question of normativity ultimately. But yeah, when I read a first paragraph like this, it's a very grand ambition to show that moral philosophy rests on a mistake. And if this were Schopenhauer, then we'd get the grand ambition, and we'd also get the kind of grand theorizing. But what we're probably going to get in this paper is the grand ambition followed by, if you put this word next to this word, and this word next to this word, then this is the result. Focus on.
I don't know. It's this is only 1912, so I'm not sure. We're certainly not to the Wittgenstein. I'm treating everything as a language game, but maybe that idea came out of papers like this. We'll have to see. 17 pages is this whole thing. So he's going to do this revolutionary thing, and it was a very influential paper. So there was something. It did something right.
I know, and I'm just being harsh up front for humor's sake. I'm open to having my mind changed here, so we'll see.
If we reflect on our own mental history or on the history of the subject, we feel no doubt about the nature of the demand which originates the subject. Anyone who, stimulated by education, has come to feel the force of the various obligations in life, at some time or other comes to feel the irksomeness of carrying them out, and to recognize the sacrifice of interest involved. And if thoughtful, he inevitably puts to himself the question, is there really a reason why I should act in the ways in which hitherto I have thought I ought to act? Might I not have been all the time under an illusion in so thinking? Should not I really be justified in simply trying to have a good time? Yet, like Glaucon, feeling that somehow he ought after all to act in these ways, he asks for a proof that this feeling is justified. In other words, he asks, why should I do these things? And his and other people's moral philosophizing is an attempt to supply the answer. That is, to supply a process of reflection, by a process of reflection, a proof of the truth of what he and they have prior to reflection believed immediately or without proof. This frame of mind seems to present a close parallel to the frame of mind which originates the theory of knowledge. Just as the recognition that the doing of our duty often vitally interferes with the satisfaction of our inclinations leads us to wonder whether we really ought to do what we usually call our duty, so the recognition that we and others are liable to make mistakes in knowledge generally leads us, as it did Descartes, to wonder whether hitherto we may not have been always mistaken. And just as we try to find a proof, based on the general consideration of action and of human life, that we ought to act in the ways usually called moral, so we, like Descartes, proposed by a process of reflection on our thinking to find a test of knowledge, that is, a principle by applying which we can show that a certain condition of the mind was really knowledge, a condition which ex hypothesi existed independently of the process of reflection. So I do like this parallel because, yeah, just like Reid and the Nyayas answered the Cartesian doubt with what by doubting the doubt, and Hegel. That's it's a very common thing. So can we not, in ethical behavior, doubt the doubt? To say moral skepticism is somehow incoherent, it seems much more difficult when I think of it that way. That we have to assume, just in moving about the world, that there are that we have knowledge of basic things, or else we would be immediately step in a hole and die or whatever. But do we need the concept of obligation? Is that as fundamental to human life that doubting that is somehow misconceived?
Yeah, I thought the parallel here for Descartes was that we're going to start out as methodological skeptics. So Descartes is a methodological skeptic about the existence of everything outside of himself, his body, other bodies, right? And then is able to use that to drill down to a principle wherein there is something that that exists that he can't deny exists, which is himself. And I thought he was going to do the same. He's proposing to do the same thing here, which is to, let's see, wonder whether you've always been mistaken about morality, and then try to find a principle that we can apply to show that a certain thing, just to show that something really is a norm. He's just talking about Descartes here. And it's not like he's going to do that. I think he's saying this is what people tend to
Right.
do. And
well,
so,
I don't know if the strategy for solving it is going to be the same as Descartes. I don't know that he's saying that Hume, for instance, is saying, let me doubt. I mean, actually, when I was teaching Nietzsche this way, I put it this way, that he's actually doing what Descartes was doing. Is like, can I doubt all the mores that have been handed down to me? Can I doubt all the more? Oh, well, I find that there's one source of obligation, which basically comes down to the will to power, that I find is so fundamental in me that I cannot doubt that. This might be a controversial attempt to interpret Nietzsche for students.
well, he does have a principal evaluation, which is health.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That you can't it seems like it underlies every single other thing that you are attempting to do, that you have to be healthy and thriving to do it.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's proceed and see. Now, how has the moral question been answered? So far as I can see, the answers all fall from the necessities of the case into one of two species. Either they state that we ought to do so and so because as we see when we fully apprehend the facts, doing so will be for our good. That is really, as I would rather say, for our advantage, or better still, for our happiness. Or they state that we ought to do so and so because something realized either in or by the action is good. In other words, the reason why is stated in terms either of the agent's happiness or the goodness of something involved in the action. So this kind of roughly maps on to a distinction between eudaimonism, which includes utilitarianism, and consequentialism, and perhaps virtue ethics, right? Because he's talking here about the agent's happiness, so I guess we would be talking about virtue ethics. Anyway, the other alternative, the goodness of something involved in the action, sounds more like deontology, obligation, something like that.
Yes, or just saying that it is a conditional good, right? I'm not sure if I'm thinking of the right word, that Aristotle talks about things, and Plato talk about things that are good in themselves or good for some instrumental good for something else. So the latter could just be saying saying there is something realized either in or by the action is good. So in other words, it could be the action in itself. Well, yeah. Anyway, we would, I think, talking about instrumental goods is relevant here, just as you were laying out before in your introduction of how we could be doing means ends analysis or something like that. So
well, yeah, no, but no, I think you're right. This doesn't really map onto deontology because he's saying in or by the action.
Right. Well, the in is
could
what's in could be deontology.
The in could be deontology, but the by, just refers to. So it's a little unclear, what he's talking about.
But certainly Hume saw his opponents as almost uniformly trying to uncover self-interest. The obligatoriness ends up being a matter of self-interest. And even though he argues against that, his own analysis, like, right, wouldn't you rather be liked than not liked? Wouldn't you rather, even though he's not saying your sympathy for someone is a matter of your self-interest exactly, well, it's still something that makes you happy. So arguing that, these things, being moral will make you happy. He's basically arguing the same thing that, Plato was doing, that you will be more well-balanced. You will be more truly called happy, even if you are not gleeful, even if we have to redefine the term happiness to cover the person who is in complete disgrace and rejected by society, but who still has their internal balance.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons that we can endorse our moral sentiments. The moral sentiment itself isn't I do this because I want to be happy, because it's in my interest. But we can reflectively endorse it, as Korsgaard points out, from the standpoint of self-interest, from the standpoint of the fact that it makes us happy, but we can also endorse it from the standpoint that we're interested in other people's happiness, which is a more utilitarian approach. All right.
Is it me?
Yep.
To see the prevalence of the former species of answer, we have only to consider the history of moral philosophy. To take obvious instances, Plato, Butler, Hutcheson, Paley, Mill, each in his own way seeks at bottom to convince the individual that he ought to act in so-called moral ways by showing that to do so will really be for his happiness. Plato is perhaps the most significant instance, because of all philosophers, he is the one to whom we are least willing to ascribe a mistake on such matters, and a mistake on his part would be evidence of the deep-rootedness of the tendency to make it. To show that Plato really justifies morality by its profitableness, it is only necessary to point out, 1, that the very formulation of the thesis to be met, namely that justice is, what is the Greek?
Alotrion agathon, which means nothing other than the good.
Okay, justice is nothing other than the good, implies that any refutation must consist in showing that justice...
Actually, I'm not sure if that's the right... Don't we have there's no footnote here?
Yeah, that's obnoxious.
Now I'm questioning myself.
I could just throw it in Google search. Does moral... Oh, no, it just pulls up this this essay. that quote. Well, and there's two more of them in this paragraph.
So, justice is it's a foreign or strange, alien. The reason why, I think there's a formulation Plato has. It's like uk allo something. Nothing other than that's why I was confused. But
well,
Lotrion. So I guess it's a foreign or strange good. That's so maybe it's strange.
Yeah. So it to show that Plato justifies morality by his profitableness, you just point out that the thesis to be met that justice is a strange thing, whatever, implies that any refutation must consist in that showing justice is, by contrast,
familiar.
Yes,
oikeon is like a familiar. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, agathon. That is really, as the context shows, one's own advantage, and that the term in the first one supplies the keynote not only to the problem but also to its solution. So the point, we can understand the point even if we don't know the literal Greek, which is, yeah, what he's saying. Show. I guess we could argue over if it is really foreign to familiar, if that's the same thing as, uh, yes, an alien command versus something that is to your self-interest. That there's obviously there's a difference between when Stirner or somebody who is saying all the moral commands are alien to you, and then Kant is saying, well, no, actually, there are moral commands that are not self-interested, that are not alien to you. You're legislating them yourself. Uh, so that just points out that if we're understanding the Platonic words correctly, that even things that are not appealing to your direct self-interest, that's going to be the overall strategy, is to somehow bring the alien into your own breast somehow. Point, as Closereads says, to human nature. Right, that's certainly what Mill is doing, or what Hume is doing.
Right. So he says the term lusitelein supplies the keynote. That's just That's just the word for advantage in ancient Greek. So, um, so it's reduced. I mean, the claim here is that this is all going to be reducible to what's to our advantage. And this is a very controversial way to read Plato, obviously, right? I think the usual reading would be that, yes, justice, these things are related to happiness. I mean, I think he'd be on stronger ground with Aristotle. But for Plato, I think he wants to say there are certain things just good in and of themselves, or by way of the form of the good, which is another way of saying in and of themselves.
But he wants to show that human nature is ultimately accordance with the form, right? As Closereads put it, your reality is not the way you are now, but it is your ideal to which your telos is aiming. So it's saying it's self-interested, not by saying, oh, well, it'll help you get money and power and the things you think are in your interest, but it is your real self-interest. Let me just keep going. The tendency to justify acting on moral rules in this way is natural. For if, as often happens, we put to ourselves the question, why should we do so and so? We are satisfied by being convinced either that the doing so will lead to something which we want, for instance, that taking certain medicine will heal our disease, or that the doing so itself, as we see when we appreciate its nature, is something that we want, or should like, for instance, playing golf. The formulation of the question implies a state of unwillingness or indifference toward the action, and we are brought into a condition of willingness by the answer. And this process seems to be precisely what we desire when we ask, for example, why should we keep our engagements to our own loss? For it is just the fact that the keeping up our engagements runs counter to the satisfaction of our desires which produce the question.
Right. So we ask these moral questions of why we should do so and so, because what we ought to do often conflicts with what we feel like doing. And if we always felt like doing what we ought to do, Kant says we'd be God in that case. I don't know if God has any feelings, but yeah, if there were no such conflict, we wouldn't be talking about morality at all. I think Hume makes this point as well. There'd be no reason to talk about morality in that case.
Keep going.
The answer is, of course, not an answer, for it fails to convince us that we ought to keep our engagements. Even if successful on its own lines, it only makes us want to keep them. And Kant was really only, right, okay. Kant was really only pointing out this fact when he distinguished hypothetical and categorical imperatives, even though he obscured the nature of the fact by wrongly describing his so-called hypothetical imperatives as imperatives. But if this answer be no answer, what other can be offered? Only, it seems, an answer which bases the obligation to do something on the goodness either of something to which the act leads or of the act itself. Suppose, when wondering whether we really ought to act in the ways usually called moral, we are told as a means of resolving our doubt that those acts are right which produce happiness. We at once ask whose happiness? If we are told our own happiness, then, though we shall lose our hesitation to act in these ways, we shall not recover our sense that we ought to do so. But how can this result be avoided? Apparently, only by being told one of two things: either that anyone's happiness is a thing good in itself, and that therefore we ought to do whatever will produce it, or that the working for happiness is itself good, and that the intrinsic goodness of such an action is the reason why we ought to do it. The advantage of this appeal to the goodness of something consists in the fact that it avoids reference to desire, and instead refers to something impersonal and objective. In this way, it seems possible to avoid the resolution of obligation into inclination. But just for this reason, it is of the essence of the answer that, to be effective, it must neither include nor involve the view that the apprehension of the goodness of anything necessarily arouses the desire for it. Otherwise, the answer resolves itself into a form of the former answer by substituting desire or inclination for the sense of obligation. In this way, it loses what seems its special advantage. All right, it's a bit confusing, so let's go to the start. So, why should we do such and such? Right, we can say it'll lead to something we want. Or the formulation.
Well, it seems
difference
right,
towards the action. Yeah.
right. It's interesting that he's even criticizing Kant for saying a hypothetical imperative is not actually an imperative at all, because to say an imperative is a command, is something you have to do. Well, so I like this, and clearly Korsgaard does like this, or Foote at least talks about this, and as a way of introducing the idea of imperative. I think she agrees with Kant. Right. So if you want to be healthy, here's a command. Here's a list of things, of prescriptions for you, and you do want to be healthy, right? Or if you want to make your spouse happy, do these things. So why is that not an imperative? It's just because imperative, that it's a contradiction in terms. Imperative actually means categorical, not hypothetical.
It sounds like it. There's a I think by now philosophers have cottoned on to the fact that hypothetical imperatives may be just as problematic as categorical imperatives, because of the use of the word ought is not fully explained. So a categorical imperative, we understand why that's problematic. You should just do the right thing no matter what you want, and you can't justify it in terms of some end or some desire. Hypothetical imperatives seem intuitively like they work because you say, yeah, I want that thing. Well, then I should do what's required in order to get it. But what do you mean should do, ought to do? Those are the wrong sorts of words. We haven't shown any oughtness, I think, is the critique. And maybe that's what he's thinking of here. So
Right. It's a desire generation. So if you want to be healthy and I give you this book that gives you all these imperatives, all these recommendations for being healthy, then you might then want to do those things. But is the creation of desire, just by realizing this means and desire, is that sufficient is there any ought involved in there at all? It seems is the claim here that there's not.
You don't want to you want to be healthy, but you don't want to exercise. And someone says, if you want to be healthy, you ought to exercise. And your response is, well, I just don't want to do that. Someone says
there must be another way. Give me the health shot.
You could say to them, if you exercise, you'll be healthy. If you don't exercise, you won't be healthy. You could say that. But where do you why an ought there? I think that's the idea. So, and someone could always say so in other words, someone could say, but why, from a ought point of view, you can still always ask that question. You haven't answered it by saying, Well, you're not going to be healthy if you don't exercise, but why should I? And we say, why should I, from the point of view of desire? Saying that you'll be, saying that you want some other thing doesn't answer that. So I think that's the idea that's already floating around by this point. The other idea, of course, is that, right, epistemic norms are just as problematic as moral norms, but we'll leave that aside. All right. So, but let me try to understand. I don't think I fully understand what he's talking about here. Um, Fails to convince us that we ought to keep our engagements, only makes us want to. So if we appeal to, right, yeah, something that we want as a justification for why we should do something, then it's no longer a moral question.
Right. You should keep your engagements because then people will trust you and you'll get benefits out of that. Clearly, that is not addressing the moral question. That is
Yeah.
reducing the moral question to a self-interest question. Is that what
So,
he says moral
to,
philosophers are doing? Because Kant certainly doesn't do that.
right. Well, Kant is, Kant is trying to avoid that. So, and that's why I think he's associating. So the other idea is that we can just try to base obligation on goodness, either in the act or to what the act is aiming at. We just say, okay, this is good, and that's what grounds the obligation, and the good is not reducible to what we desire. Um, so then the next thing he says, suppose when wondering whether we really ought to act in the way is usually called moral, we are told as a means of resolving our doubt that those acts are right, which produce happiness. So we could say, um, we could both appeal to goodness and appeal to happiness at the same time. We could say that there is something called the good, and it's not reducible to happiness, but it does produce happiness. I don't
But
know if that's
that
what he's
can't
on
be
about here.
why. I mean, clearly he's saying that if you say that's why it's good, because otherwise, I mean, I guess probably he's going to end the paper as G. Moore would by just saying, well, you don't reduce good to anything else.
Right.
Good is just fundamental. If you reduce it to happiness, then you have gotten rid of the
Yeah.
obligatoriness.
So we can say the good produces happiness, but we don't want to reduce it to happiness because then it just goes back to reducing it to desire, which is not morality anymore. And then he wants to split us off. If we do say it's productive of happiness, then we can go the self interest route or maybe the virtue ethics route, or we can go the utilitarian route. That's right. That's why we ask whose happiness. Um, so we could start out by saying, it's your own happiness, but then I think he, uh, I think he again he'll think that seems to reduce us to desire,
Mm-hmm.
and it's no longer a moral question. And then instead we could say, well, anyone's happiness. So we ought to do. Um, it
And we can
sounds
still
like
reduce
he's
it to
talking about
desire.
utilitarianism. Yeah,
If you're Hume, then you still we just have fundamental desires that are not further reducible to self-interest, that an interest in other people's happiness.
um, or we could say working for happiness is itself good, and the intrinsic goodness of an action is the reason we ought to do it. Right. So the advantage of this appeal to the goodness of something consists in the fact that it avoids reference to desire. So we could say, irrespective of whether we actually want to be happy, even if we didn't want to be happy, it would be the good thing to do because happiness just is good.
Well, and
Um,
is saying if it is an obligation to myself, well, that seems to take the moral benefit out of it. Well, Kant's argument about suicide, for instance, that you actually do have duties to yourself. You do have duties to your long-term happiness, to maybe your dignity of life, something that maybe is not even put in terms of happiness, right? If we're
well,
talking
the way
about,
he puts it is
yeah.
that it's absurd. He loves contradiction, right? And
Hmm.
that's categorical imperative and rests on that. So with suicide, it's absurd to use your freedom to exterminate your freedom from the world. It's
Yep.
a self contradiction. Um, but here, right? Okay, so the advantage of appealing to goodness, right, is that we get something impersonal and objective, and it seems that's the way it seems possible to avoid the reduction of obligation to inclination. Okay, good. Um, all right, I think that sets us up right for the next part.
Yep.
Okay.
I think it's you.
Now it seems to me that both forms of this answer break down, though each for a different reason. Okay, the two forms are which? Uh,
Is it good? Is it the activity good or is the results good?
well, is it either that anyone's happiness is a thing good in itself, uh,
There were
or
several
that?
contrasts in that long paragraph.
No, I think it lines up with what you're saying though. So the two possibilities are anyone's happiness is a thing good in itself, or working for happiness is good in itself. So
Yep,
working for happiness
exactly.
puts the goodness in the action,
Yep.
and right, the alternative is to put the goodness in the end of the action, which is happiness. All right,
All right.
so we can go either way. All right. Um, Consider the first form. It is what may be called utilitarianism in the generic sense in which what is good is not limited to pleasure. It takes its stand upon the distinction between something which is not itself an action, but which can be produced by an action, and the action which will produce it, and contends that if something which is not an action is good, then we ought to undertake it. Then we ought to undertake the action which will, directly or indirectly, originate it. Well, there's a very convoluted way of telling us what utilitarianism is. All right. Um, all right. So, yeah. So, if we put the end in happiness, right, the happiness of all, then we have utilitarianism. Now, let's look at. Okay. Well, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, but so he's going to now critique this formula. But this
Yeah. We're
argument,
not going to get to the second form yet.
if it is to restore the sense of the obligation to act, must presuppose an intermediate link, namely the further thesis that what is good ought to be. The necessity of this link is obvious. An ought, if it is to be derived at all, can only be derived from another ought. Moreover, this link tacitly presupposes another, namely that the apprehension that something is good, which is not an action, ought to be, involves just the feeling of imperativeness or obligation, which is to be aroused by the thought of the action which will originate it. Otherwise, the argument will not lead us to feel the obligation to produce it by the action. And surely both this link and its implication are false. And there's a footnote. When we speak of anything, for instance, of some emotion or some quality of a human being as good, we never dream in our ordinary consciousness of going on to say that therefore it ought to be. The word ought refers to actions and to actions alone. The proper language is never so and so ought to be, but I ought to do so and so. Even if we are sometimes moved to say that the world or something in it is not what it ought to be, what we really mean is that God or some human being has not made something what he ought to have made it. And it is merely stating another side of this fact to urge that we can only feel the imperativeness upon us of something which is in our power, for it is actions and actions alone which directly at least are in our power.
So, he doesn't like oughtness belonging to states of affairs. It sounds like they can only belong to actions. And this
Mm-hmm.
first alternative we're considering is that if we put goodness in the state of affairs that's being aimed for by the action, then we can use that to ground a sense of obligation. But he doesn't think we can do that. So let's look at some of the details of this because I wasn't fully clear on them. So we want to, right? We want to milk some sense of obligation out of this. The thing that we're aiming at is good. And we're going to do that with the thesis that what is good ought to be. So the oughtness kind of goes out there into the state of affairs.
Mm-hmm.
And why are we doing that? Because we need, if we're going to have ought, we need to derive it from another ought. So good just becomes a way, just becomes oughtness so that we can get ought into the action. We derive the ought in the action from the oughtness of the thing being aimed at by the action. All right. But then this presupposes another link, that the apprehension that something good, which is not an action, ought to be, involves just the feeling of imperativeness or obligation, which is aroused by the thought of the action which will originate it. All right. So this is this is really the whole thing I was talking about with hypothetical imperatives. This is why he doesn't like hypothetical imperatives. Why he doesn't like calling them imperatives, because, right, we see that something is good. We see that some action is going to produce the thing that we think is good, but that doesn't mean that there's an obligation or imperative to produce that thing. He doesn't think that feeling comes into it.
I guess
That was my whole example with, exercise and health.
sure. And I'm also
Yeah.
thinking about other kinds of normativity in objects. So saying this painting is beautiful, certainly that doesn't say you should therefore paint some more paintings like this one or something like that. It would not even occur to you that, this is a calling for me to paint. I mean, maybe you as an exceptional individual might find that's what inspiration is.
Well,
But it certainly is not a general moral claim that it
what
makes
about
upon.
beautiful things like this should exist?
I mean, don't you feel like that is part of what is inherent in the notion of beauty? I'm so glad that this exists.
It
I'm,
should
I'm,
exist? Ought to exist? That's the question.
yeah. So I see
You want it
where,
to exist. You're pleased by it existing. You're saying, yes, I want more to exist, but does that rise to the level of shouldness?
right. And I see where you were suspecting that this was going to be about applying moral concepts correctly. And he's saying that it is not a correct application of moral concepts to apply oughtness and therefore goodness. But I just thought that was how normativity works, is normative language works, is we substantialize all sorts of things. That murder is killing that ought not to be done, that is bad killing, that is the definition of it. And so we work, right, but yet it refers to an action, but it is attributing oughtness to it. I just think that there's, if we're saying we're basing this all on our moral intuitions, well, yeah, that's one of my moral intuitions. I don't think murder should occur. And it's not just that I don't think I should do it. I don't think anybody should do it.
But, right, okay, but look at the transition you just made, right? Murder shouldn't occur, but what if it were a mudslide that killed someone? And you said, well, mudslides shouldn't occur. You're not talking about any oughtness, right? The mudslide is not an agent, and there's no ethical
Right. Murder is an action,
implication.
at least.
You're
So
just, when you say murder, when you say, yeah,
corpses
when you say
killed by
mudslides
murder should
shouldn't
not
occur, you
exist.
just mean I don't like it when they occur. But when you say murder shouldn't occur, you have to be talking about the action of some agent, or else moral obligation doesn't come into it. So you can't use the badness of the occurrence in order to justify the oddness of the action, because there just is no oddness in the occurrence. There's badness and goodness in the sense of I like it or don't like it, but there's no oddness until you get to the agent, I think, is the argument. And by the way, I was saying this argument is floating around at this time, this famous argument. This is the famous argument. This is why this paper was so important. This is the argument against hypothetical imperatives. I think. Maybe there's someone who did it beforehand, but yeah.
All right, we're up to page 25. Perhaps, however, the best way to see the failure of this view is to see its failure to correspond to our actual moral convictions. Suppose we ask ourselves whether our sense that we ought to pay our debts or to tell the truth arises from our recognition that in doing so, we should be originating something good. For example, material comfort in A or true belief in B. That is, suppose we ask ourselves whether it is this aspect of the action which leads our recognition that we ought to do it. We at once and without hesitation answer no. Again, if we take our illustration as our illustration, our sense that we ought to act justly as between two parties, we have, if possible, even less hesitation giving a similar answer. For the balance of resulting good may be and often is not on the side of justice.
All right.
Sounds very
What is
Kantian.
he saying here?
We don't want to ask, well, is it going to hurt anybody? You know, that's not the certainly that does not exhaust the question of whether something is obligatory.
Okay. Um, balance of the resulting good may be and often is not on the side of justice. What is he talking about?
Maybe paying you back involves giving you the weapon that you're now going to use to kill somebody. It's that old example.
We ought to act justly as between two parties. I'm a little confused.
So I might owe you some money, and it's my obligation to pay you back, even if I really need the money and you are a rich bastard and obviously don't need the money. So it would produce much more justice if I were just to keep the money and to break my promise and use it to feed my starving family. But yet we think
Well,
morally,
on a
I owe
certain
you that.
interpretation of justice. That's why I'm confused here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why I think
right.
he's just saying
Okay.
this is the Kantian intuition that he agrees
All
with.
right. All right. So let's go forward. At best, it can only be maintained that there is this element of truth in the utilitarian view that unless we recognize that something which an act will originate is good, we shall not recognize that we ought to do the action.
We should not recognize.
We should not recognize that we ought to do the action. All right. Okay. Unless we thought knowledge a good thing, it may be urged, we should not think that we ought to tell the truth. Unless we thought pain a bad thing, we should not think the infliction of it without special reason wrong. But this is not to imply that the badness of error is the reason why it is wrong to lie, or the badness of pain the reason why we ought not to inflict it without special cause.
Maybe read
Why
the
is
footnote.
that not the reason?
He's a clarifying footnote.
It may be noted that if the badness of pain were the reason why we ought not to inflict pain on another, it would equally be a reason why we ought not to inflict pain on ourselves. Yet, though we should allow the wanton infliction of pain on ourselves to be foolish, we should not think of describing it as wrong. Well, that's a weird thing to say.
Well, that's
Wouldn't
clearly just identifying the moral with the social, our obligations to other people. I mean, this is just consistent with what he's said throughout here, that we don't want to say we have obligations to ourselves, that's not something, that's not a Kantian sentiment he agrees with.
But who says that? I mean, who denies that? Utilitarians don't deny that we have obligations to ourselves. I don't get it.
No, he's saying we don't have obligations to ourselves. We should, it's just foolish. It's not an obligatory. So it goes hand in hand with his, well, of course you don't want to feel pain, right? Pain is bad. So therefore, as a hypothetical imperative, you should not poke that tack into your arm. But that's not an actual moral commandment. That's just prudence. It's foolish, but it's not wrong.
Yeah, but he's trying to get at the psychology of this, what the average person would say, or what we would say. Um, Do we agree with that? Do we agree that? I mean, I get that his argument about hypothetical imperatives, but
I think it goes with.
agree with that?
I think it goes with. I mean, this particular example goes with the normal way we use the words. In other words, our sentiment about which to consider a moral wrong and which to consider a a disrecommended act for some other reason.
Okay.
I
Go
think
ahead.
it is, I think, just because this form of the view is so plainly at variance with our moral consciousness that we become driven to adopt the other form of the view, namely that the act is good in itself and that its intrinsic goodness is the reason why it ought to be done. It is this form which has always made the most serious appeal. For the goodness of the act itself seems more closely related to the obligation to do it than that of its mere consequences or results. And therefore, if obligation is to be based on the goodness of something, it would seem that this goodness should be that of the act itself. So, yes, he has these Kantian sympathies. We've established that.
But well, Kant would say the will, but go, keep going.
Sure. I mean, yeah, right. Deontology is taught as if it's the goodness of actions, but that wouldn't actually describe Kant exactly, because it is something about the actions, the willingness, the motive. Moreover, this view gains plausibility from the fact that moral actions are most conspicuously those to which the term intrinsically good is applicable. I mean, I guess right, we don't, do we, so this is about the use of words. Do we say that ice cream is intrinsically good? No, we don't say that. Do we say that state of affairs is intrinsically good? No, it's only because people like things that way. We never say that the happiness of a young child is intrinsically good. I mean, who knows? Like, is it the young
Yeah,
child
that's
because we've
fine.
drugged the child? Well, no, it's not intrinsically good. We want them to be happy for the right reasons or something like that. We want them to flourish. Okay, the flourishing of a young child is intrinsically good. Even that seems very weird. It's good because of the young child. The young child will find it good, but it's not intrinsically good.
Yeah, well, I'm comfortable with the idea that we're going to talk about actions typically when we
Mm-hmm.
talk about what's good, and the important thing is that there be an agent of some kind, right? Or else moral goodness doesn't apply. That's why I brought up that mudslide example. So,
Yep.
but it's not just right. We have to be careful, as I said. There has to be. We have to talk about intention or willing here because we might unintentionally do good things that, but that doesn't mean that there's any moral quality to the act. So we have to have a good will for Kant, according to Kant, in order to be doing something good. All right, so I'll just keep going.
Yep.
Nevertheless, this view, though perhaps less superficial, is equally untenable, for it leads to precisely the dilemma which faces everyone who tries to solve the problem raised by Kant's theory of the good will. All right, at least he's talking about goodwill now. To see this, we need only to consider the nature of the acts to which we apply the term intrinsically good. I'll just keep going here.
Yep.
There is, of course, no doubt that we approve and even admire certain actions, and also that we should describe them as good and as good in themselves. But it is, I think, equally unquestionable that our approval and our use of the term good is always in respect of the motive and refers to actions which have been actually done and of which we think we know the motive. Okay, he's actually going to use this point against me, the will part, and against Kant. All right. Further, the actions of which we approve and which we should describe as intrinsically good are of two and only two kinds. They are either actions in which the agent did what he did because he thought he ought to do it, or actions of which the motive was a desire prompted by some good emotion such as gratitude, affection, family feeling, or public spirit, the most prominent such desires in books on moral philosophy being that ascribed to what is vaguely called benevolence. For the sake of simplicity, I admit the case of actions done partly from some such desire and
Omit.
partly.
Sorry, not admit.
Oh, I omit the case of actions done partly from some such desire and partly from a sense of duty. For even if all good actions are done from a combination of these motives, the argument will not be affected. The dilemma is this: if the motive in respect of which we think an action good is the sense of obligation, then so far from the sense that we ought to do it being derived from our apprehension of its goodness, Our apprehension of its goodness will presuppose the sense that we ought to do it. All right. That's important. In other words, in this case, the recognition that the act is good will plainly presuppose the recognition that the act is right. Whereas the view under consideration is that the recognition of the goodness of the act gives rise to the recognition of the rightness. On the other hand, if the motive in respect of which we think an action good is some intrinsically good desire, such as the desire to help a friend, the recognition of the goodness of the act will equally fail to give rise to the sense of obligation to do it. We cannot feel that we ought to do that, the doing of which is ex hypothesi promoted solely by the desire to do it. Okay, so that just reduces again the desire.
This
So the
this blows
first
my
case,
mind a little bit. Just that I thought that if you say an action is good, that's the same as saying an action is right. That it's just that rightness is the proper word to apply to actions, whereas goodness is the proper word to apply to objects. But here he's saying, no, you could apply goodness to the action taken as an object, but that it derives from rightness, which specifically has to do with obligatoriness to do it, as opposed
right.
to, as the point he's just made, like, I really think that charity is, it's good that charity, that the giving of charity exists. I just think it's good that that exists, as opposed to you should give charitably. Like, no, those actions are right means that we should do it. So just saying that they're good is kind of just a weird sentiment.
Yeah, I think goodness is a larger umbrella term in a sense, and it's harder to describe. Yeah, and the rightness, as you pointed out, is associated with the obligatoriness of the action. So, can we derive the obligatoriness of an act from its intrinsic goodness? And we say, well, it's a of all the good things that we might describe, some are external and some involve actions. And then when we apply goodness to the action, it becomes a question of right, right? It's action plus good equals right or equals obliged. Um, his point is that no, we call the action good because of this sense that it's obligatory.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Yeah, my opinion of this paper is much higher than when I began. It's a good paper to read.
Uh, are
Any
we
more
out of
comments
time?
before we
Should
end for
we?
today? Yeah.
Yeah, let's. So we're through the seventh page out of the, the sixth page out of the 17. Um, I don't know if we can do this in one more, but let's definitely keep moving through it with a part
Yeah.
two. So, uh, sorry for having to re-explain this every time. If you're hearing this, perhaps on one of our public feeds, the part two or part three, if we record it, will be released only behind the paywall. So that's patreon.com/.
Give
Philosophy.
us money.
Which of my 10 URLs? Patreon.com/closereads philosophy. Or if you're hearing this on the Patreon Partially Examined Live feed, you can just upgrade your membership there. Yeah, thanks for hanging out.
Thank you.
Bye.